Hi, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the Breakout Writer Series, an evening of tea and tarot with Diana Khoi Nguyen and Hoa Nguyen. Uh, my name is Shrestha. I'll be introducing our guests for tonight and starting the event off. It's so nice to see everyone here. Um, yeah. Um, we would just like to begin tonight by acknowledging that the Black Mountain Institute operates from the city of Las Vegas, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Southern Paiute people. Thank you to our guests, Diana Khoi Nguyen and Hoa Nguyen. Thank you to all of you for tuning in and from Vegas and Reno and beyond. If you aren't already familiar with Black Mountain Institute, we aim to bring writers and the literary imagination into the heart of public life. We do this by way of our year round events like this one, through fellowships, through student enrichment opportunities, and through publications like The Believer and Witness Magazine. Uh, Before we get started, just a few reminders for upcoming events. So please mark your calendars if you haven't already. On Friday, March 26th at 2 p.m., back by popular demand, is the second session of the Circle, led by BMI Sharing Fellow Jordan Kisner. It'll be a shared virtual creative working hour. So gather your writing instruments and come work together in spirit with us. On Wednesday, March 31st, you can join us over on Instagram Live at Black Mountain Institute. We can drop the handle in the chat for the first episode of Ask Anime Wong, starring BMI Sharing Fellow Sally Van Mao and featuring poet Chen Chen. And this will continue weekly on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. And then on Sunday, April 4th, Black Mountain Radio returns for a full season of 6 episodes, airing weekly at 4 p.m. on KUNV 91.5 FM, or you can also stream it live on kunv.org/live. You can sign up for these events and learn about the rest of BMI at blackmountaininstitute.org. The link will also be in the chat. Now, it is an honor to introduce our guests for tonight, Diana and Hua. Diana Khoi Nguyen is an American poet and multimedia artist. Her first book, Ghost of, oh, background, never mind. Okay, I won't try that. Her first book, Ghost of, was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Award in Poetry. Currently, she teaches creative writing at Randolph College, low residency MFA, and is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Diana will be in conversation with Hoa Nguyen. Born in Vinh Lao and raised and educated in the United States, Hoa Nguyen has lived in Canada since 2011. Her books include As Long as Trees Last, Red Juice, and Violet Energy Ingots, which received a 2017 Griffin Prize nomination. Hoa teaches in Miami University's low residency MFA program and the Milton Avery School for Fine Arts at Bard College, where she serves as co chair of writing. Her forthcoming book, A Thousand Times You Lose Your Treasure, which I am so excited about, will be published in April 2021 by Wave Books. I just also want to add that a link to order Ghost of, Diana's book, from our friendly neighborhood independent bookstore, Writer's Block, will also be in the chat. I can't talk enough about this book, and I won't. But I just want to say this: Diana names and maps absence and intimacy and familial histories in ways I didn't even think were possible in poetry till I held Ghost Off in my hands for the first time. And it's actually been a book I found myself revisiting a lot this year. And every time I discover an articulation of longing I hadn't seen before, which I think we all really, really needed and will always need. So all this to say, do yourself a favor if you haven't already. Please buy and read this book. The link is in the chat. And please help me welcome through the chat Diana Khoi Nguyen and Hoa Nguyen.
Hello. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm Hoa. It's so great to see so many people here, and it's wonderful to be joined by Diana Khoi Nguyen. Diana, I wanted to say, I don't know if you saw that I posted a promo for our event online on Instagram, and Ocean Vung, our mutual friend, wrote, "This looks like a win-win situation. I'm sorry I couldn't help it."
I've been off of social media, so I'm so glad that you shared that with me. You know, that's usually the analogy, the phonetic analogy I use when people don't know how to pronounce the name. I'll just say it's, like win, like a win-win situation, but here we have an actual.
An actual. I usually say win like victory, and then usually people
Ooh.
can hear. You can use that one. It's a
Okay,
good one.
I'm gonna collect all of them, but I will say I met I I'm really friendly to people at call centers when I call them, not when they call me. Sorry, this is kind of a side note. And I met one once where he had multiple pronunciations of this last name because one when actually told him it was pronounced a different way, and we were having this conversation. So anyway, but maybe that's kind of ethical thing.
We'll exchange win-win conversation. I wanted to actually begin with your book. I love Srethna's endorsement of it, particularly the notion that it articulates an enduring longing. What was it? An articulation of longing. Um, and I thought, yes, an articulation of longing. It was I think particularly apt at this time as well. Why it feels compelling. And since tonight's sort of theme being tea and Tarot. Oh, by the way, what tea are you drinking?
I'll just leave myself unmuted. I'm drinking Essentia Cherry Rose. I love green tea, and I feel like it's bringing spring to me, or I'm coming to spring, right?
Essentia cherry rose.
Yeah.
Oh, it sounds amazing.
Yeah, it smells like cherries, but it doesn't taste strongly floral. What are you drinking, Hua?
Mine smells a little bit like bergamot because it's a decaf Earl Grey with milk. But it's not hot. It's cold. Like a lot of pots of tea I make, I let them go cold, but then I can't bear them to throw them out, which I think is a very like sort of first generation American thing, Vietnamese diaspora thing of like not being able to throw away things that are perfectly good. Um, and so I am drinking Earl Grey cold with milk. But I started to say, Diana, if I could impose upon you, because our theme, besides tea, which of course to me also has a double play, and poets love double plays on words. I think of like telling the truth, telling the tea, and the slang and the drag race slang that I learned it from, but also divination. And I wanted to open with a quote from Robert Duncan, speaking of Black Mountain. He was a teacher at the original Black Mountain College, who wrote about divination and tarot. And in one quote, he says that divination is working with things to release the content and form. In this case, of future or fate, by bringing something that we choose to act upon us and draw these things by chance out. So I thought I'd do a kind of divination by way of a bibliomancy, which is to open a book at random, to sort of encounter something in that chance encounter, to introduce this thing from the outside to release content and form. And so I thought I would do a bibliomancy on Gustav. And if I would love to read the text that arrived for me and maybe ask you about it. Maybe you'd forget why you are here, that you didn't belong, that just because it was like life didn't mean it could be life, that you could come back to life, but not return to living. And if you bypassed a war couldn't bypass you. And this comes up juxtaposed to the one of the many images that are included in the text with the missing figure.
Thank you for reading that. I think I thought you were gonna read like a whole poem, so I was like, I was ready to kind of settle in. But that little fragment, a lot of what you're saying has been resonating so much with me. So I already feel like a lot of stores of emotions kind of opening up, which is, I'll kind of respond to this with something that just happened. We were kind of like in the Zoom green room right before the webinar opened. And then all of a sudden, so I was there, and so was Hoa, and so were all the other rectangles on the screen. And then all of a sudden, a Diana Khoi Nguyen with camera off entered. And so then there were two of us. And I was really calm on the surface, but I was freaking out. Nobody else was freaking out. Everybody just kind of looked a little puzzled. And then maybe they looked at me as if I was like trying to do some performance art. I didn't know what to do. Like, I didn't have any other device logged in, which is to say, I kind of felt it was like a fractured version of myself or a future ghost of self, right? Or like some kind of time traveling. I don't know physics. Was also kind of like momentarily glitched into that space. And because I was co-host, I was quite cruel and I removed myself. And I was worried that it would erase me, like, but I remained intact, which is to say, there's a way in which we can continue to be alive. Our organs are working. But it doesn't mean that we are alive. I don't know if that makes sense, right? Like I think about the multiple lives that maybe my parents have kind of gone through. And when I think of like maybe a traditional sense of like that they started over, they entered into a new country and they settled down new roots, or they tried to figure out the lay of that land, and then they like moved forward through it. You know, but what about the other selves? You know, when I think about all the creatures, I've been recently watching, sorry, this is kind of a sprawling response. I've been watching these 70s French aquatic mini documentaries, and I'm obsessed with shrimp. And I didn't know that shrimp molt. And I was watching the shrimp molt out of its shell. And I think too of like the skin, the shell that we discard, but we can also see it next to our living body. But it's also like, I used to occupy that. Anyway, this is a long way to say like, I'm thinking about all those things, even though I didn't think those things, 4 years ago or 5 years ago when I wrote those words, that the past can be present at all times, right? That even though you don't look back for whatever reason, maybe because you don't want to or you can't, it will look back at you. It will surpass you. I don't know. I don't know. Okay, so it just happened again. So like all of a sudden I'm now again in the room and it just went away. That's really creepy. My heart is beating really loudly. I feel like somebody else is playing a trick on me. Okay, that was really scary. I don't know if anybody else could see that. Anyway, I'm gonna let you speak because
I saw it. I saw the ghost of Diana Khoi Nguyen come onto the panelist and then disappear. What do we make of that? Well, I'm not sure. Although I do have my theories about the nature of time, which is that it's not linear. And actually this is all theories that other people have had. And it has to do with, there's like spooky events in quantum physics. And there's a way that you can like visit past selves in the present because everything's happening simultaneously. It's all very interesting. And I kind of feel that as writers, we're time travelers too. And I've been curious about how that might look in your work. But before we got too far astray from the divination moment, I wanted to ask you about the deck that that you wanted to introduce into the conversation, because it's not that one that I work with, although I also have the deck that I know that you're about to introduce.
Yes, thank you for focusing us. I love it. It's like a gentle tether. I don't know if this is mirrored, but I'm bringing in the Asian American Literary Review tarot deck, and different writers, Asian American writers, have kind of reconceived what should be in an Asian American tarot deck. So it doesn't correspond or correlate with kind of, I think, the European tradition of tarot and where tarot kind of comes from. So there's a card that's like the refugee, the deportee, the adoptee. I don't know why I'm saying all the ones that end in T. I guess, okay, sound and poet. Yeah, and then they got different Asian American artists to draw each of the ones as well. So there's the Fool, but there's also like the Mother, and there's the Daughter. There's one that I hadn't noticed recently, which is like the Lech, like, and I think it talks about an uncle that's like a creepy uncle. And immediately I thought about mine, the one in my life. Yeah, and I got this because it came as a part of an emergency kit for mental health, which is a topic that's not often openly discussed within, at least within my community and within my family, my Vietnamese American family. So that's the one I'm bringing, and I don't consult it often, but the last time I did was at my book launch, so it's kind of nice to bring it back. Yeah.
Do you remember the card that you drew at your book launch?
I took a picture of it, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it might have been the Fool. Yeah.
Oh, well, you know, the Fool in the traditional tarot has very specific meanings. I don't know what the AALR deck. I also have it, but I have the later edition, so it's yellow. And I used it when I got it, and like you, I also received it as a gift. That's kind of a tradition, although it's not necessarily a stricture. You don't have to adhere to it. You can buy it yourself. But yeah, the Fool is a great card to draw upon when you are about to launch your book, because the Fool is the one that launches themselves into air, and with all sort of maybe foolish, maybe brilliant trust, and goes forward into the unknown, which actually usually catches them.
The unknown catches the Fool. Is that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
In a kind of beautiful embrace, because it's like living inside of your instinctual body. And when I asked the deck a question, because my book is coming out next month, for the last however long, since maybe the last couple of years, I've been asking about like conditions around making my book, conditions around my book coming out. What do I need to know about my book? All the questions that one might want to ask about a creative project. And I got varying answers, but when I asked this deck, the card it presented me is not a traditional tarot card. It's numbered 10 in this deck, and it's the Farmer. And it helped me recognize or re-recognize something about a main recurring character of my manuscript now book, coming out next month. 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure is the name of the book, which is my mother, who has this very colorful biography as part of her life, which was as a circus motorcycle stunt woman. But she also grew up on a farm and grew up in farm culture. And then I had poems where I call her Farm Girl. And so, and it also reminded me of what a farmer does. Like a farmer is someone who's attuned to celestial conditions, right? Of the seasons, of the return, of reaping and sowing. and having to understand those celestial, processional, cosmological shapes intimately, right? Like hands in the soil, but also sharing the bounty and abundance, you know, within their regional communities, and being really, really intimate in those things. Diana, I wanted to share with you my deck and ask you whether you'd be interested in asking questions that are designed to sort of open up more conversations about creativity with me.
Yes, thank you so much. I would love, I know you have multiple decks, so I'm curious to hear what you'll be drawing from tonight.
Yeah, so I do, when you get into divination, and my first divination system was the I Ching, and which is an ancient oracle of Asian origin. It's a Chinese system. I've always been interested in how we can connect with something that's beyond ourselves to get information and seek the correspondence. It's really about correspondence and having a kind of metaphorical ability to move meaning around for new understandings. The deck that I'm shuffling right now is a deck. Oh, we got a really beautiful card showing for us a 2 of Cups. This is the Rider-Waite, which is a classic deck. It was drawn by Pamela Coleman Smith in collaboration with a fellow called Waite, and it's called the Rider-Waite because it's named after the card company and the man. But the illustrator, Pamela Coleman Smith, was really quite influential on all decks subsequent to it. And I tend to alternate between it and a deck that's called the Mythic deck, which is based on Greek myth, and it was designed in the 90s. But I thought I would use the Rider-Waite Smith deck to be in circulation, and then refer to my other deck too. But I'm wondering if you wanted to start with one of the questions that we were like circulating around this conversation. And I thought a good one would be, let's see, the one I was sort of thinking about was about how do we receive information. And before I draw a card, maybe I could just ask you what your thoughts are about that, and then with your permission, elaborate with the card that arrives.
Oh, okay. I feel like it's like I'm giving part of the iceberg and then the rest of the iceberg after I know the water level. I guess in terms of my response, I've been thinking a lot about the sonic realm of knowledge, of knowing, which also is tied to the tactile, because sound are waves which get absorbed through bodies. And that's how sound disappears, because it gets absorbed into something. So I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean when I hear something, but I don't know yet how to place it? Or how can I hear something when I was so attuned to the visual realm? So just thinking, and there's a kind of dichotomy there, which is like the audio and visual realm of data and information. Of course, there are others ways of knowing, but I've been thinking primarily of those two because I've been working in the audio visual world. But in the audio world, you cannot turn it off, right? Like you cannot close your ears. And I'm myself, like others that I know, I'm quite sensitive to sound. We just say sound enters your body and like stays there. So I'll just kind of start there. I mean, I have so much more that I can say, but I've been thinking about sound information.
Is this a newer idea that you've been thinking with since your book Ghost Stuff?
You know, it's taken on a new tributary, but there's a poem in the book that talks about like what exists between sound and soundlessness, but also form and formlessness. Because I think a lot about how I can't hear my brother anymore. So that thread is there in the book, and I was listening a lot to what's the word? It didn't have lyrics, but to instrumental music, so classical music, classical compositions, incessantly while I was writing. But my relationship to like listening to a ghost or thinking about how a ghost doesn't make sound or how it makes other kinds of sound is a lot different now, because now I'm thinking about sounds within the diaspora, the sounds of the living, but also in the diaspora, it contains all the vestiges of all the elders and all the ancestors who aren't with us anymore. And how do we carry those units of information too? Yeah. Do you have a relationship to sound, Hua? I'm just curious.
Well, I do. I I I drew some cards while you were talking, and I was kind of wanting to play with the constellation of the three cards that came up while you were talking about your relationship to sound and how it's changed. The reason I asked about the follow-up question of whether this was a newer idea was because the Page of Swords came out, and it's sort of this swords are like a air element, like the mental capacities and ideas, and pages are a symbol of sort of a youthful pursuit, still sort of apprenticing one's ideas. But it was that card arrived between two other cards, and one of them reminded me of a kind of theme in your book, Ghost of, which is, and it's the card, the 10 of Pentacles. And you can hopefully see the image here in the Rider-Waite deck that Coleman Smith, like a commenter in the chat, noted. She was a theater production artist, and so all of her images really are like these kind of great sort of full scenes or dioramas, where you always have a horizon line. And the scene with the 10 of Pentacles is a kind of family scene, and there's something sort of stiff about the diorama of people. They're all sort of looking in different directions. They seem to be involved in their role, but in a way also not necessarily interacting. And then on the other side of this Page of Swords, this particular moment, which is also like a person, and I can't help but think like the missing brother, is a card that's actually like the opposite of the Page of Pentacles, which is like this sort of scene that's a little bit too constrained, which is a scene of celebration in the Four of Wands. And you can see in the drawing of the Four of Wands that it's like a couple like celebrating under like a hoopah. It's like a structure outdoors. There's like people in the background celebrating, and it's really a community card. So it's almost like you're turning your attention towards how it's actually coming from the smaller container of the family to the larger space of community, but also maybe also involving other forms of registers inside of this community making.
It's quite prescient, or of course, seeing. I was really struck by when you used the word, there were so many things that I'm responding to here. I hope to be perpetual apprentice. So even if I've been thinking about sound for years, I'm still an apprentice to thinking about sound, and trying to follow where it goes, in terms of where I find myself. So where do I find myself now? In my community, both familial and kind of diasporic, but also like literary and all the other kind of circles. I think you used the word stiffness. There was like a stiffness to the diorama.
Yeah, in the 10 of Pentacles. It's like a family that looks like they're complete, but they're actually there's a sense of like stiflement.
Oh, I feel really emotional as you were saying that. And I was like, that's very much my relationship to my own family, um, which is there's a lot of them. Like maybe not my immediate family, but I have tons of extended, in my extended family. And most recently, everybody had been gathering because my grandmother um, was in a coma. I mean, she passed of old age a couple of weeks ago, but everybody had gathered because they knew like her body was no longer taking in food, and so then comes the amount of time it takes when the body cells what's left in it, if there is anything left, and then it's still alive until it's not. Um, and there was this uncanny thing where my uncle set up a computer and a Zoom link so I could spend time with my sleeping grandmother. So I did for a whole day while I was working, and I'm thinking this is less about my grandmother and it's more about the drama of her 10 children surrounding her then pending death. And there was a stiffness because they were not coming together um, in celebration. I think it was under the guise of obligation. Oh my gosh, I hope none of them are here. Oh, wow. We could talk about that too. It was under, it was like they loved her. I mean, she was a woman who did not have enemies. Um, but the way in which they secretly war with each other and how that manifested in their coming together produced a stiffness that felt out of place in that time of kind of remembrance and mourning. And I was kind of witnessing this from afar, quite literally, like when I was in the Zoom room, nobody knew I was there. And so I could hear like what they were saying, in the kitchen or something. Um, it was just so strange. It felt like I was behind the scenes in the diorama of another place, which was, San Jose, California. And when I think about the Four of Wands and scene of celebration, it's very much like my immediate community, my chosen family, my chosen community. Um, and I am forever sandwiched between those two. I think my therapist would very much like for me to extract myself out of the diorama, but I can't do it. Filial piety or what? I don't know. Do you have this problem, Wa? Do you have a diorama upon which you cannot escape its shadow?
We all have our dioramas.
Oh my God.
Well, what's interesting to me too is that another figure, so this is the fourth card, and it'll be the last card before I take you off the spot with this. But the fourth card and the last card that I'll draw on this particular moment uh, elaborates on the Page of Swords and showed the Knight of Swords, and so that's like a slightly more. It's like actually quite activated questing energy, almost as though I want to suggest, do you ever feel like that part of your role is to sort of swirl around in between like chosen family and like the received, or inherited family of origin, or sort of like structures that are like inherited structures and ones that you improvise, create, and elaborate with, as a way to sort of I keep doing this sort of swirling movement with my hand because it's a sign of Mercury or like Gemini. It's like the ability to move with language in particular.
I love it because you're not really going anywhere per se, right? Because you're staying in a similar unit to space, but you're in motion, right? Like it's the wheel, but it's the horizontal. Where was I going to go with this? Oh, you were talking about inherited, but also the generating. I think absolutely. Like I think of myself and I identify as very much, Vietnamese American. which is its own kind of third entity, right? And I would even say subcategory Southern Californian Vietnamese American, which is like whenever I meet a kindred fellow person, whether or not they're a poet or not, we get along quite fabulously. Which is to say, there's something about the culture in which you were born in that house, in the house in which you grow up, and all of those structures and rules and languages, right? And then what I learn at school, which is a very different set, and how from those two pools, from those two banks, you construct a self, you construct your own a language, and how that shifts and morphs as I migrate or I move to a different city, to a different state, rural, urban, and so forth. And then I travel, and all of those things accumulate. Which is to say, the circle is just going around the globe, Hoa, you know?
That's all.
Yeah, I mean, yes, like, right, like, but movement is really key. It's so funny. I was chatting with my spouse about this, or more like he was just telling me something that he observed, which is I can never feel settled. Like, I refuse to truly say that I live in whatever place that I'm in, because I don't know. I don't know what that means to feel like, oh, I live here. Like, oh, I sleep here. I eat here. Sometimes I'm walking there, you know? Yeah, but to kind of maybe turn it to poetry, thinking about, I'm not versed in the traditions of my parents, but the various places where I have spent time and where I have studied were quite conflicting, quite competing. You know, when I first started to play around with poetry, it was, the universe is making new material, so you should too. It's a lot of pressure. Why write a sonnet? Who cares about the sonnet? You know, and it was just about let's explode things, and sense is secondary. And then to go to graduate school where it was all about craft, the slow crafting of things, almost to think about dioramas and the miniature. But I also wrote sonnets. I mean, and I saw in the comment there enough sonnets. But there was something too that was liberating when I began, because I was studying prosody, but I began to like think and dream in iambic pentameter because I was studying it so rigorously. And so in order to write in iambic pentameter, it became not hard. Which is to say, when I devote myself, it's like, I'm like the magic school bus. Maybe like this is a very specific kind of cultural reference to how I grew up. But the magic, if you remember like the story, and I think there was books, but the magic school bus, like, it like travels inside the body so you could know the full circulatory system or whatnot. And there's something like that's so immersive. I feel like I'm totally like deviating from maybe where all of this went. But I think this is still related to the concept of not only like how do we receive information, but it's also like oftentimes we get an abundance of data and information, and what do we make of it? And I'm curious, in your various kind of registers and realms, Hua, like how do you fashion from the various pools and the various banks of information?
Yeah. How do I fashion? I mean, sometimes it begins, well, actually, I would say almost every time it begins in a relationship with something else. Right. So it's often from my reading or from an encounter or from an experience. So there's something about that, to sort of borrow from your Knight of Swords, which is the figure of Mercury. It's something about like actually having to like be in contact with and get feedback from, to echo with, which is art. I mean, Simone Weil says like without no echo, no art, right? So I think that's the simplest answer for sure. You asked me earlier about sound. And I have like my specific like set of references that I think are deeply embedded in my poetics. One has to do with language and language loss. when I moved to the US from Vietnam, I was a toddler. That I could speak Vietnamese in the way that someone who's 20 months old can speak a language. And when my son was that age, I was really interested to see how much language he actually had. At that point, he could sort of transmit sort of basic sentences, but it was complete comprehension. There was understanding. Anyway, I lost my language coming to the US. When I did, there weren't hardly any Vietnamese communities. My mother wasn't interested in speaking Vietnamese, was living in an English-speaking household with her husband, myself. So I lost my language, but I also had access to tape recordings of Vietnamese folk songs and the collected or the best of tracks of Johnny Cash. And as a very young child, I remember listening to those songs. And so songs and folk songs and folk stories and myths and ghost stories actually fascinated me. That was my favorite section in the library, was sort of world myth and ghost stories. I think I was interested in how we narrate experience and how we embed inside our narration the stories that give meaning and animate us across generations. I would like to just pay attention to the time, because I see that it's coming to quarter to the top of the hour. I could probably talk to you for another hour about your work. I would love to invite you to read a poem, if that's possible. I would really love to hear you read anything you'd like to read. I know Gustav is part of the reading of some of our attendees, and there are questions that people might have for you about that book.
Yeah, thank you, Hoa. I think I'll read something. Maybe I'll just read that one about sound that I mentioned. And I did have a burning question, just selfishly, that I wanted for us to maybe think about too. But this ties into the poem that I'll read. It's one of the triptychs. I just have to find it. But I've been thinking too, like, we've been talking about tarot, and of course, there's the subtext too of drinking tea. And I've been staring at my tea leaves, which are in a little strainer next to my mug, and thinking about how the distribution pattern of the leaves form their own diaspora, right? Or their own archipelago, so to speak. But when you're writing, because you mentioned having echoes, you mentioned sitting with, being in contact with other art. It's kind of a similar experience for me, except first and foremost, in addition to the books and the art, I'm also sitting with objects, personal objects, personal familial objects, which is to say, like, I'm also sitting with things from the archive. Actually, right now, I never mention it because it always creeps people out. But every day when I work, the water bottle I have, the story about this water bottle, this is my brother's water bottle. So when I drink from it, his lips also drink from it. I mean, it's been cleaned several times, but and it's funny because I had this originally and I lost it. And my brother had seen my water bottle and liked it and bought it. And then after he passed, if I didn't have one anymore, it filled in for the one that I lost. And there's something kind of, I don't know, lovely about that. And like the tea kettle I used today was my brother's tea kettle. So there's the ways in which the things that belong to the people who aren't present are also in contact with me as I'm like sitting to work. And those are just like particular everyday objects. But of course I work with the photographic archive. So that's the piece that I'll read now. And I'm curious to hear, like, I want to know, like, do you feel too that the objects are conspirators or collaborators, co-composers, right? Like as you're writing and as you're making as well, in a sense, because it's more than just like they're accompanying you, but like that's if they're nudging you towards something too. Um, at least I feel that that has been my experience. I've been talking and I've not been pulling up this poem. Oh, okay, here we go. And for those who have a book, this is the one on page 35. But if you don't need to follow along visually for accessibility reasons, I do recommend even just like closing your eyes just to listen, because it is so much about sound. And for those, if this is new to you, this is the photograph. It's a triptych because it begins with a photograph where my brother removed himself. And then the next two pages are the poem as the body, and then the poem as the framework around the body that is missing. And because we are on Zoom, when you hear silence, it's not a glitch, it's just me not speaking. All right, and then I look forward to chatting in just a little bit. Thank you so much for listening, and Hoa for asking these questions and reading the tarot deck alongside me here. Triptych. With eyes closed, he waits for his body to do the same. A fistful of grains, rice let go from the hand of symbolist. First, the rainstorm, then trio of crickets, a stream, then a trickle like someone who has the hands of a mother or father to guide him. But the house is empty. He is emptying out every hour, all hours before his death. He is dangerously close to living. His body is warm, his mind cool. What are the tricks for warming? He no longer feels the watch against his wrist. He no longer feels a wrist. He no longer. What may exist between appearance and disappearance, between sound and silence, as something that is merely nothing, slow music, quiet music, spare music, of sound and form I fell asleep tonight after feeding us both. It was hard to think of you cold. It was hard to think. You think it was hard to think of you? It was hard to think. While I slept soundful, the wind howled and wet its whistling teeth. It has sound but no form. What has a form but no sound? There is no sound for everyone. Not everyone has a sound. There is no sound, for there is no sound there, for everyone is there. Anyone between the sound and the silence, some solitary figure ambling along the loop. No sound, no sound in which the performer is silent. He is a point to parting. No sound, no sound overtaking sound to the verge of vanishing. No sound, not one, no one silhouetted against the empty scores, no duration to mark, but still a space to occupy an occupation. Tonight, I fed you first, then myself, then fell asleep. We have departed from the cage, that it is not a space we occupy. A sister who is dreaming becomes a sister in another sister's dream, momentarily forgetting that music is playing. Something startled me. A voice in the room I thought was empty. Did you jump over? Did you jump back? Over and back. Did you jump? Did you jump back? Did you? Over here, I stretch the replay across the ear and longer. It keeps me alive. It keeps me alive. It keeps alive. It keeps me alive. It keeps me alive. It keeps me alive. It keeps me alive. It keeps. Thank you for listening to that.
Thank you. Thank you. And you read from the poem that I had sampled when when we opened. I appreciated that for circularity. Speaking of circling around, it is 10 to the top of the hour, and I had said that we would entertain questions, and we do have a question for you, Diana, about your book and what surprised you most since your book was published.
I don't think I've said this part quite as explicitly. I think what surprised me was how it changed my family. So my mother, my father, my sister, and I. It changed our relationship to our grief, our individual, but also our collective grief. Because in one way, it like made the particulars of the event so public, and I was quite worried about that. But I had spoken with my family before the book came out. But you know what it was? It was like when my parents started to go to events. I mean, I would be selective about what I read, but it wasn't that they were responding to me, but something changed for them when they saw how other people responded to the work. And then that changed how they thought about their own relationship to the grief they were not expressing to each other or even acknowledging to themselves. Which is to say, it gave them permission because they saw other people in grief, strangers in grief, right, going through their own grief. And so when my family came together, we weren't necessarily talking about the book per se, but there was a new kind of openness in them, and that surprised me. I didn't know that that could happen. And that's the thing about larger community, that they now had access to a topic within the larger community, because you don't talk about that stuff at work or at the gym or the library or the grocery store, you know. And they saw just like strangers who would share their own stories with me. Yeah, so I guess that was deeply surprising. I could not have anticipated that. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'm so glad that question was asked earlier before our time tonight. I do what I do sometimes, which is I check in with my deck just to say like, hey, what can I expect, later today? And I got some things that I understood what they were referring to. But one card came up that I wasn't really sure how that would enter in our conversation. And it was the card, it's number 15 in the major arcana of the deck, which are the ones that are named. And this one's the devil. And it's like, people hear the devil and they think of like, the horned one down under, but it really, it's talking about the ways in which we remain captive. Yeah. In which we remain captive. And one of the big, it's a lot of things, but that's something that came up from what you were just saying, but also shame. It's like deep shame. It's the kind of shame or feelings of the worst sort of self-recrimination that are hard to release, and therefore you keep yourself sort of in captivity to them, which is really what the devil card is about. So it's almost as though the thing that surprised you is to recognize that the captor is yourself, and that it can be released, but it's like as though the work had activated the release for your parents in a way that was surprising.
Yeah, in this kind of roundabout, indirect way, right? So it wasn't like me talking to them about it. It was me talking to strangers. Yeah, shame rules maybe too much in the familial households I know. And I try very often to acknowledge where it comes from my parents, because I feel like I have to start there first before I then offer the door out. And for myself too. Oh, the devil that keeps captive. Thank you for sharing that card.
Well, it's also the card of how you release, one can release oneself from those kinds of captivities, and it's actually an advancement of the soul, really, in its position in the deck. You had asked me a question about my relationship to sound, and there's a question in our among our Q&A questions about the parallels between reading tarot and writing poetry. And so this is sort of an answer to that question, in that I've thought about this question a lot, about this relationship between sound and poetry making, or my poetics. And the card that has come up for me with that is Judgment, which in the Rider Waite, it's Gabriel with the horn. It's like the angel blowing the horn, and there's like dead rising up. And because of its biblical resonance, some modern decks will rename that card. One renaming is Discernment, so that it's not so much about Judgment Day, but it's about how one can like look upon the intelligent patterns, and leave behind like what no longer serves, and like take forward the things that do, to champion yourself into the future. But the element that's common is this sounding. So there's a sounding that happens that it allows the rising up, that allows like a renewal, that allows the rebirth of full awakeness to consciousness. And I think of this card, Discernment or Judgment, it's the number 20 in the deck. So like its relationship to the Fool, which is the 0, which came up earlier. Unlike the Fool, which isn't quite awake, this card is fully awakened, and it's awakened by this sounding that animates. And so I'm always interested in how language itself has the potentials for releasing meanings, emotional correlations by its arrangement, that it connects us to the previousnesses, that it animates the future, that we learn from the past, that we learn from living traditions, we create our own actions. This is a whole sort of thing that this card brings to mind for me, having to do with sound.
There's another automate. Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking.
I think we can fit in one more question before too long. I think this one's about your book and ekphrasis, right? So here in your case, the photographs, or is it, the question goes on to wonder, a kind of rejection or subversion of ekphrasis? So writing in a relationship to them, but never in an aboutness.
Yeah, thank you for this question about ekphrasis, and I wish I'm not following the Q&A, so I don't know who to attribute the thanks to. I would say it is a kind of subcategory, maybe perhaps, or relative of ekphrasis, but again, like I think I brought this up before I read the triptych. I'm quite thinking about, I'm composing with. It's like, because I think often ekphrasis is something else exists out there, and then there's a response to it. Yes, in a way, I am responding to the photograph, but it's more of like the photograph and I are writing together on the page. Yeah, that it's a co-authoring, which I think is different than ekphrasis, because in that co-authorship, I think what I'm generating is like a third thing, if that makes sense. And they're kind of tied together. Yeah, so I mean, that's how I'm thinking about it. I mean, maybe that doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I feel like my thoughts are feeling a little jumbled. Like I'm working within home video archive. So like moving video, or that was redundant, but like moving image. And I'm not like writing about it. I'm like literally writing in, right? On top, like layering on top, which is another kind of collage, right? It's a way in which I can bring my present self into the past archive and to kind of exist and be together, which I think ekphrasis can contain. I see that Shrafa's back. Hello.
My subtle entrance into
Oh,
video.
okay.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you to both Diana and Hua for this magical evening. And thank you to all of you attendees for joining us today. You can support both Diana and Hua by purchasing Ghost Off from the writer's blog, and you can also pre-order 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure. Both links are in the chat. Um, and I'm sorry we couldn't go through all the questions, but thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful night.